Alex from CosmicSkeptic says that even if God exists, morality would still be subjective. Is that true?
I'm now of the view that all morality, even religious morality, is ultimately subjective. And this makes objective morality impossible, as far as I'm concerned, even just in principle.
So I think Alex in this video makes two big mistakes. The first is near the beginning, where he tries to define morality.
First, I need to define what I actually mean by morality, and this isn't as simple as it seems. I suppose I would define morality as the intuition that we ought to do that which is good and ought not to do that which is bad.
And that is the problem. See, Alex's definition is based on moral epistemology instead of moral ontology. That is a huge distinction. See, moral epistemology is how human beings come to understand morality, how they interpret morality. It's our relationship to it. Whereas moral ontology is about what morality really is. Now, if morality is objective, then it would exist wholly apart from our personal or corporate thoughts, preferences, and opinions. And so defining morality this way right out of the gate is going to inevitably lead to a subjective conclusion, because you're starting with a definition that describes morality in a subjective way.
A person's religion is, more often than not, determined by their social and geographical background, just as atheistic morality is.
So one of the ways his first mistake sort of works its way out is with a genetic fallacy. Alex goes on to explain that a person's beliefs are formed by their upbringing, or their geographical location, or the time period in which they exist. The problem is that none of these factors have anything to do with whether or not a belief is true. Now, to give Alex credit, he does admit that atheism would be in the same boat.
How else could a person possibly prove to themselves or to others that one religion has a superior ethical code to another? How else can a Christian possibly believe that the ethical code of Christianity is superior to that of Islam? If you want to compare the ethics of two religions, you need some moral basis on which to judge them. But that moral basis obviously can't be one of the religions, and so the only way that you can decide which religion is morally superior is through a subjective analysis of which you feel is better. It's ultimately a subjective decision based on your, not your religion's, moral intuition.
So this subjective definition doesn't allow a religion or a worldview to be the standard itself. You see, it's very possible that any one of these worldviews is actually true. And a worldview is an explanation of reality, including moral reality. And so if a particular worldview is true, such as a religion, why wouldn't that be the standard by which to measure all things?
So the only difference is that the Muslim believes their morality to be objective, even though it isn't, according to the Christian, whereas the atheist doesn't. And suddenly, we're once again in the realm of subjectivity.
The only reason that we're in the realm of subjectivity is because we began with a subjective definition of morality. Various disagreement doesn't necessarily entail that there isn't an objective truth. When two golfers disagree on a scorecard, it means that one of them is wrong or both of them are wrong, but it doesn't mean that both of them are right, and it also doesn't mean that there isn't a correct answer.
The only thing that seems to distinguish religious morality from atheistic morality, even according to the religious here, is that the religious believer feels like their morality is objective, whereas the atheist recognizes the subjectivity lying at the heart of ethical decision-making.
I'm not sure why Alex has exempted himself here, in that the religious believer only feels that morality is objective, but the non-religious person is recognizing something. This is sort of a subtle ad hominem, where you're trying to undermine someone's claim by invalidating their character. There's really no grounds for this. Why can't the religious believer recognize that morality is objective, and the non-believer feel as though it is subjective? That would be just as possible, and so I don't think Alex is really saying anything here. But again, this is an outworking of that original subjective definition.
Therefore, we can see that the religious claim to objective moral values is ultimately based on two things: a subjective recognition of the superiority of a person's particular religion, and the feeling, rather than the fact, that the morality of that religion is objective, even if it actually isn't. It's all subjective.
It's all subjective, so this definition keeps asserting itself throughout the video without providing any grounds to believe it. Alex wants to say that it's all a subjective recognition, which tempts me to wonder if Alex even believes that an objective recognition is even possible. Because the fact of the matter is that if there is no way to objectively know something, then Alex's original definition of morality would itself be a product of his own subjective experience.
Or let's say that you agree with what I've said, but you just don't think that your religious morality is based on a subjective recognition of the moral superiority of your religion, but rather on the objective evidence that your God exists. This, I'm sure, will be a common rebuttal. You believe that your religious morality is true, not because you've judged it to be ethically superior, but because you think that the God of your religion has been proven to exist, or your religion proven to be otherwise factually accurate. So, okay, I'll grant you it.
More credit to Alex, he anticipates our objection. But this is where big mistake number 2 comes in.
You still need to demonstrate objectively that because something is good, we ought to do it, and because something is bad, we ought not do it. Of course, it seems stupidly obvious and absolutely instinctive that we ought to do what's good. Of course we ought to do what's good. But can you prove it?
Why ought we do what is good? Why ought we follow God's commands? On the surface, it sounds like a profound question. But when you examine it closely, it sort of betrays an understanding of who God is, or what the foundation of morality is like. If it's possible for morality to exist objectively, and God would be the logical foundation for that morality, then God's commands are just an extension of his own nature. God is supremely authoritative, and therefore his commands are supremely authoritative. God is omnibenevolent, and therefore his commands are ultimately good. And God is perfect, eternal, and non-contingent, meaning that his commands are not arbitrary. And so God himself is literally the source of oughtness. Oughtness is a description of reality, it is a description of our relationship to God. And so when you ask, why ought I do what God commands, you're actually asking, why ought I do what I ought to do? Which is a lot like asking why a triangle has 3 sides, or why a bachelor is unmarried. In the words of the atheist neuroscientist Sam Harris,
we have hit philosophical bedrock with the shovel of a stupid question.
Now, if we started with Alex's original definition of morality, then I think that this question he's asking is perfectly valid. But because he mistakes moral epistemology with moral ontology, this question is no longer coherent. Alex remains pretty consistent until near the very end.
Now, don't get me wrong here. I am, like I say, a moral subjectivist myself, and so, of course, I don't think there's anything wrong with constructing a moral framework based in subjectivity, as I'm claiming the religious do, as long as the framework is recognized as such. All I'm saying is that whilst religious morality claims to be objective, it is in fact ultimately subjective, and so needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper or grounded ethics.
Alex says there's nothing wrong with constructing a moral framework within subjectivity, as long as the framework is recognized as such. So he inserts a moral qualifier here, and so there's a subtle objectivity in morality that's being smuggled in here. It isn't explicit, but it's definitely there.
And so needs to stop presumptuously claiming the sole right to proper or grounded ethics.
It needs to stop. More smuggling.
It's not just the religious who I think claim their morality is objective when it really isn't. There are many people who are atheists and still believe that morality can be objective, with the most famous atheistic case for this probably being Sam Harris's in The Moral Landscape, or at least the most influential. So in my next video, I want to dismantle Harris's case for objective morality and show why I think it's still ultimately subjective.
So near the end of the video, Alex sort of redeems some of that consistency by claiming that atheistic worldviews are also completely subjective, such as Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape. If you haven't seen the God Debate 2 between Sam Harris and William Lane Craig, I highly recommend checking it out. So to wrap things up, the first mistake is confusing moral epistemology with moral ontology, how humanity relates to morality versus what morality is in and of itself. And the second mistake is asking a question which turns out to be incoherent. When you ask, why ought we do what God commands, or why ought we do what is good, because of God's nature and the way that that correlates to reality, you're really asking, why ought I do what I ought to do? Which isn't a coherent question. God's nature is the grounding of oughtness. It is the definition of oughtness. In the same way that 3 sides define a triangle, or being unmarried defines a bachelor. I hope this helped clear some things up, and I'm sure we'll do more response videos in the future. If you have any ideas or suggestions for what videos you'd like us to respond to, please message us or leave it in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.